Hello and welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today we look at income inequality and economic efficiency. By the government's own admission, using OECD figures, the UK has one of the highest levels of income inequality in the European Union. Even the introduction of the national living wage, this government report says, has had very little impact on inequality in household incomes. So what does the disparity in income do for the efficiency of an economy? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Yeah, just how big a drain on the economy is inequality. Well, Steve, of course, if poor people earn more, they'd spend more companies would make more, and then they'd sell more stuff because people are spending more. Is there any flaw in that reasoning? Because it seems like a lot of politicians struggle with this one.
Well, they come back and say that inequality is necessary to provide incentive. That's the if you think about how they justify the level of inequality, they say, well, yes, you can't have a totally equal society, and I completely agree with that. And then
it's a question of degrees, though, isn't it? I mean, if you
a question of degree, yeah.
If you are really in struggle street, it's going to be pretty. Sometimes it's just impossible to pick yourself up from it.
Well, that's the thing. We really have what we've become used to, then what we still have in our minds is a mass consumption society. We have a society where the wage that was paid to workers, and this is really going back in some ways to Henry Ford, the wage that was paid to workers was sufficient for the workers to buy what they produced. Mm. And the profit came out of the fact that bankers were also buying and other capitalists were also buying, and capitalists make a profit. But it's been based on selling to a mass consumption society. And that was active right up until about the early 1970s. And one of my little theories in life is everything went wrong in 1973.
That's the precise year. Have you got it down to a month? Year. Got it down to a month yet? Was it middle of 73 or?
Maybe my 20th birthday. But it was 1973 where the trend of rising wages, particularly in America, ceased. So between 73 and 77, then if you want to date the point, at that point, there'd been a regular increase in middle class and working class income. So wage earners were getting a rising share of GDP up until that point.
Right.
And then from that point on, GDP continued to rise, but workers weren't sharing in that rise anymore. The real effective income for a lot of workers has not risen for something of the order of 30 years.
So what changed in the mid-70s then to make that happen?
Well, my usual bloody answer again, another credit bubble burst. Right. And what we're not being paying attention to has been driving the inequality. But that seemed to be the breaking point in terms of where the share that was going to workers just stagnated. And there's been a rising profit share since that point, where you include both the profit going to industrial capitalists and the profit going to the finance sector. The two rose. And my analysis, the argument that I have developed out of my models more so than anything else, because my models reproduced the characteristics of the Great Recession and the Great Moderation beforehand, but they also reproduced the rising inequality. And this is something that I did not have in my mind before I built my Minsky model.
Not something you set out to prove, it was just a byproduct.
It was an unintended, unexpected side effect because... And then people look at we'll put some links to some of the Minsky models in the podcast, but one of the key ones is an incredibly simple model that just has three social classes: workers, bankers, and capitalists. Workers bargain for wage rises depending upon the level of employment. Bankers get an income dependent upon the level of debt and the rate of interest, and capitalists get an income after they pay the other two. And it's all simply derived strictly from economic definitions. There's no ideological thing like a labour theory of value built in there, which Marxists would have, or a marginal productivity theory of income distribution, which neoclassicals would have. It just simply says, here are these three social classes. Workers can get wage rises if employment is low. Bankers get an increase in income if debt is high. And you simulate it. And what I found was where, even though in my simple model, I didn't have any borrowing by workers or households, I simply had borrowing by firms. Mm-hmm. The income that when bankers' share went up, the income share that compensated wasn't capitalists, it was workers.
Right, so they lost out
They
for the
lose
capitalists.
out.
Right.
And I explained the logic of that in Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? It took me a while to understand what the hell was going on, because this is what's called in complex systems an emergent property. And emergent properties are not things that you can derive by looking at an individual component. You've got to look at how the whole thing interacts. And in a lot of the explanation that Minsky had for a crisis occurring, which I was expecting to be reproducing, were things like a rising rate of interest over time, meaning that people's debt, initially the debt burdens were bearable at the level they committed to, but the interest rates rise over time, so that burden was not sustainable, and so on and so forth. And that sort of thing, you can often blame the Federal Reserve for putting up rates too high. But they had none of that. It simply had a fixed interest rate, no change in the interest rate. A bit like what I was effectively modelling is the margin between deposit rates and loan rates remain constant. That's what I was effectively doing. And what I found was, much to my amazement, that the capitalist share fluctuated around or near an equilibrium. As the bankers' share rose, it was the workers' share that fell. And I thought, what the hell's going on here? And the logic is simple. And interesting enough, a little bloke with a weird, really, really bushy face called Carl made this argument back in 1867. And in trying to explain his verbal cyclical model of the economy, he made a statement saying, in other words, the rate of investment is the independent variable, not the dependent. The rate of wages is the dependent variable, not the independent. And he was right. When I simulate the system, investment determines the level of output. That determines the level of employment. And the desire of capitalists to invest when it hits where they need to borrow money to reach their desired investment, so their desired investment rate exceeds retained earnings, that of course means they've got to borrow money from the banks, so they start paying income to the banks. That leads to a boom. In the real world, what tends to cut off the boom is rising input prices, particularly raw materials. I leave that out, but I just look at like rising wages instead. But you can extend it to saying what would happen if oil prices rise and stuff like that, which we saw back in the 70s, obviously. So the rising level of input prices cuts profit. There's a rising level going to debt as well. The boom comes to an end. You go into a slump. As the slump goes on, the wages share and the raw materials costs fall. Mm-hmm. You start paying down some of the accumulated bank debt, but you get back to the point where capitalists are willing to start borrowing money again before the debt was being eliminated. So the debt has risen a bit, and you're back to the same share going to capitalists. Yeah. You're now paying money to bankers as well. It can only come at the expense of the workers. But
even in those good times, workers aren't getting their cut, because I mean, you mentioned the point that when there's a lot of demand for people, you'd expect wages to go up, but that's not been happening over this decade.
We've now got to the stage where wages are so stagnant that wage rises have barely exceeded inflation and quite frequently been below it.
Yeah.
And you look at the case of the UK, we know that wages in real terms haven't returned back to the levels of 2007 after the financial crisis. So for 11 years, in that sense, while GDP has been rising, workers have not been benefiting from it in terms of an increase in their pay rate. They've been getting finally recovery in employment, but not a recovery in the wage rate. So their capacity to spend is no greater than it was 11 or 12 years ago, whereas the pact that kept the American dream together was that real wages would rise virtually every year. And, the old rising tide lifts all boats. Well, now one of those boats has been anchored at the same point for between 10 and 30 years, and it's no wonder that particular boat is getting rather cranky about taking on water.
Yeah. The common argument, of course, is if you do push wages up, then that reduces the profits of companies, or it forces them to automate, and then they reduce the number of jobs. So it's actually a bad thing for workers. Conveniently, they'd be better off if they earned less. I mean, seriously, that is the argument we hear, isn't it?
John Kenneth Galbraith put this quite brilliantly some time ago, and he said that you can summarize mainstream economics in the proposition that the rich don't work hard enough because they're not paid enough, and the poor don't work hard enough because they're paid too much.
Yeah. which is crazy stuff. But I mean, but is it as simple as saying, well, we just need to boost those wages at the lower end? Is that actually going to help to reduce this question of inequality? I mean,
I think not while the debt is there. And this is again, this, I sound like a crack record to myself, which is why I find this frustrating.
But the debt isn't sitting with those people at the bottom end, though, is it?
It doesn't matter. Right. It's an income claim on the capitalists.
Yeah.
And that has to be paid. So if you have debt, this is one of the ironic things.
So long as that money is going to the capitalists, it's not going, if it's going to the owners of the company who can use it for productive use to grow the company and employ more people, then that's a good thing. And obviously if the people at the bottom end are paying a bit more, then they've got more money that they can spend, which is helping the economy. You're happy with those two. It's just the amount that's going to the
not when it's going to the bankers.
Yeah.
Not when it's going to the bankers. And that's the trouble that goes to the financial sector. So the increase in inequality really has been a transfer of wealth from the working class to the financial sector. And that's even without, like in a stylized model, without the workers borrowing. Of course, they do borrow on top of that, and they get caught up in asset bubbles. So what we've done is we've replaced leverage and asset bubbles for income distribution, and ultimately that's on a hiding to nothing to lose. And it comes down to why does inequality matter? What's wrong about inequality? Because, as you said at the beginning, there are arguments that we need inequality, and I agree with those to some degree, some extent. But it's gone beyond that point.
Well, there's a lot more to that discussion with Steve. If you want to hear the full version of our chat, then you need to become a subscriber to Debunking Economics. On the Debunking Economics podcast, go to debunkingeconomics.com and choose one of the subscription plans on the right-hand side, or become a supporter of Steve on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. If you pledge to provide $10 or more support for his work each month, then you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. So hopefully you'll do one of those two things, and we'll see you back here for the full version of this episode and become a regular listener to the podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie with Professor Steve Keen. We'll see you next time.